Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from West Coast time zones. My name is Nicole Gable. I am the Chief of Sales for Adecco Group North America Professional Recruitment and Solutions. And we want to thank you all for joining our webinar on risks and solutions for returning to work. If you do have questions that you would like us to answer, you can submit them into the questions panel, and we will try to save as much time as we can to answer those at the end. If not, we will come up with a forum to address those questions like an FAQ, and you can always reach out to us individually, and we will help you in any way that we can. So the agenda for today, we have a lot of things to pack into the time. Number one is risk. Risk is at the forefront of all of our business and personal decisions. The legal exposure of returning to our brick and mortars, as well as our desire and need to drive business continuity and to recover from the disruption that we've all faced. Number two, we were going to talk about the uncharted waters with the ever-changing guidelines. Many of our clients and companies have shared that they do not have adequate resources to be able to stay on top of the evolving guidelines, the potential legal reform to remain compliant with the federal and local mandates that are changing on a daily basis. We're going to discuss the need and best practices around creating and navigating hybrid recovery approaches of return to work, answering the questions of should we return to work? If so, who and how? Outlining some of the major risks that companies are facing and some best practices and guidelines to mitigate them, and how you can get access to best practices and resources so that you can stay on top of these challenges. You can move to recovery and out of the defensive position that I think we have found ourselves in the first 6 to 8 weeks of this pandemic into an offensive position for today, for tomorrow, and for the new way of work. Additionally, I know most webinars are really problem spotting, and we are doing that today, but we are also presenting some of the solutions, specifically our reInvent Solutions program that we at Adecco Group North America Professional Recruitment and Solutions put together as an end-to-end COVID-19 response solution to help all of our clients in many of these different ways, as well as sharing the reason why and how behind that, because many of you may have the resources to do pieces of this or all of this on your own. And then finally, as I mentioned, we will get to as many of the questions that you submit as possible. So very briefly, who are we? The Adecco Group Professional Recruitment and Solutions is a family of brands, accounting principals, Parker and Lynch, Agilon, Special Counsel, and Paladin. We help our clients with temporary staffing, executive search, and consulting, spanning through finance, office, and legal spaces. We have 1,600 US colleagues in the United States. We had over 40,000 US associates on assignment in 2019, and we're proud to say that we have over 10,000 clients in the United States. We are also part of the International Adecco Group. And in North America, some of our proud sister companies are Modus and Adecco General Staffing, and we would like to welcome and thank all of their clients who attended today as well. In addressing this webinar, I have found when talking to clients is that people are really willing to pull back the curtain and have open and honest discussions as to the best practices and the plans that they are putting in place to come out of this stronger and come out of this together. And this is really our goal today. We have the advantage of working for a very large global company. And as a result of that, we have significant resources in risk, in legal, and in our HR departments who have been working really consistently around the clock since all this began in the United States, and frankly, before that, due to all of our companies and sister companies overseas. So the best forum here I felt was to invite some of these experts to address some of the questions and some of the Adecco Group's response. So I have invited Vanessa Hodgerson. She is our Senior Counsel, Head of Litigation, Labor and Employment and Legislative and Governmental Affairs. Amy Heron, she is our Senior Vice President for Human Resources. And Laura Schrader, who is our North America Practice Leader for Consulting. I'd like to thank all of them for taking the time today to help with this webinar. So moving to the offensive, mobilizing organizations to action. I would love to start with Amy Heron. Thank you so much again for joining us, Amy. When we talk about moving from initial response plans to the pandemic to return to work plans and then hopefully as quickly as possible to move forward plans. You have been instrumental in our company's response in business continuity and return to work planning. As a senior HR professional, can you just share us what were the one or two things that kept you up at night during this pandemic?
Well, Nicole, first, thanks for allowing me to be with you today. And I think in answer to your question, what's the main thing that keeps me up at night during this pandemic is definitely the safety and well-being of our employees. That's number one for sure. This situation is different. We have encountered in the US many disasters and issues before that we've become all too familiar with, dealing with natural disasters like hurricanes, floods, or fires. But in those situations, there's a beginning and there's an end. There's a specific area that is impacted, so we can, have all of our resources focused to help in any way we can to help that situation. Here with COVID, of course, it's not just one area. It's unpredictable. We don't know where the next outbreak is going to be, and everyone is really reacting very, very differently. And there's not one identified way to deal with this situation for sure. It is really a lot of different resources that have to come together and deal with a very volatile situation that is really stemmed and fed with a lot of emotion around it.
And so, Amy, when we were thinking about moving forward and recapturing some of this momentum lost during the whole stay-at-home period, how are your teams approaching this?
Yeah, good question, Nicole. The first is listen. We have to listen to our people, listening to our clients and our employees. What do they expect from us as their partner and their employer? When it comes to our employees, communication has been key. We have done many things to ensure that we have the pulse of our employees. We have launched internal videos with the latest information brought to them by our key executives. And we've hosted live webinars so people could ask questions and get real-time answers of what we are doing, how it is impacting our company, whether that's financially, whether that's in employees that are impacted, et cetera. And we've also been using internal Facebook groups to help people keep in touch. So not only sharing information about COVID and our response to it, but also keep up the culture and the morale and sharing fun things that might be happening during this time for sure. And our surveys have been critical. We've issued many surveys to our employees, which have, as a result, we've been able to develop new programs around wellness and wellness campaigns, and also development programs that we are now launching that are different than we have in the past to keep people upskilled and reskilled in many cases during this time. Our clients, we found that they have relied on us heavily to partner with them on strategies to safely return to work. So a lot of communications and sharing of best practices with our clients as well, as we really become the change agents and rethink the way that we work. We're rethinking about our brick and mortar, as you mentioned in the introduction. Do we need all of the real estate? How do we rethink our service offerings to our clients? And how do we develop talent differently for the skills that we need for the future world of work?
Excellent. Through this whole process, and I know that you have been working hand in hand with legal and with risk and with our C-suite and business leaders of the field. Is there anything that particularly surprised you about the process of developing these response plans and implementing these policies? Or maybe if there was anything that you thought was more time consuming or complex than you would have anticipated?
Yeah, it is more complex than I anticipated for sure. And I like to use the term that it takes a village, because in this COVID response, it definitely has. It's really become all consuming for many of our departments, our HR operations department for sure, a lot of our legal resources. This is one thing that benefit us from being part of a global organization as the Adecco Group, because COVID started over, of course, in China. So our leaders over there were on a global task force with all of our 30 different country leaders. And so we have been able to know almost what to expect and how it was impacting our colleagues and how it's impacting our clients and our business. So we were positioned a little bit better, if you will, than they were, because we got to learn from them. And locally, you know, our task force you mentioned, legal, we are tied at the hip with Vanessa and her legal team. Also IT. We have been so fortunate to be able to work remotely so seamlessly, because IT has really stepped up and given us the resources we've needed to be able to work remote. So it's a task force with IT, HR, legal, risk, and communications that we put together to ensure that we stay on top of this. Our calls have increased tremendously in HR. We have moved our call center from just employee relations and daily questions from our thousands of colleagues to really, they become contract tracers, which we'll talk more about later, creating policies for COVID. And so that's really surprised me, the amount of time and effort to address all of the things COVID related.
Yeah, and I would like to just add in the pace, because I can tell you that the field has been very impressed with how quickly that we have been able to pivot and move, and that really is attributed to all of the support the field has gotten from your department, from legal, from risk, really across the organization. So thank you. Amy, one more thing on this topic. We get a lot of questions from companies and clients that are much smaller than ours with fewer resources in legal, HR, and risk, who definitely want to stay on top of such a fluid and volatile situation. Do you have any advice for them on how they can approach this, or some things that they should prioritize in your opinion and experience?
Yeah, another good question. I would say absolutely prioritize, as far as resources, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control website. And it is a very fluid, ever-changing, daily changing website with the latest and greatest. So definitely stay abreast on a very regular basis with what the CDC has on their website. Then secondarily, I would say, you know, your different state health department sites, and definitely OSHA. And then there are different law firms as well that have great advice as well. But I would prioritize the CDC website as number one.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. And I will be calling on you or tapping you later to answer some more questions. But now I think we're going to move on to assessing the on-site risk. So on this slide, we're talking about mitigating the risk of potential liability, keeping the workplace safe. So for folks who are bringing people back to work or have people actually in brick and mortars, you, much like Amy and your entire team, have literally been working around the clock. And I'm aware of that with our risk department, with Amy's HR department, to assess and quantify all of the legal and business risks involved in creating one of these return to work plans, and definitely prioritizing the safety of our own staff. Could you walk us through the types of legal liability and risk exposure that we and other companies are facing, and some of the theories of liability?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you see at the bottom of this slide, Gibson Dunn stated on their website that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce considers to be possibly the largest area of concern for the overall business community is the potential for class action suits alleging unsafe workplaces that have caused employees to contract COVID. And they're right. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a number of claims that I've identified that I've seen personally as a result of the Adecco Group having relationships with over 10,000 clients in the United States during this time. The most common thing that we're probably seeing is related to OSHA complaints or on-site inspections. Workers' compensation is becoming incredibly active right now, especially as states are passing legislation related to expanding coverage. local health or government citations and penalties for violating those local health orders. As Amy mentioned, local health departments are issuing guidelines and requirements, as well as mayors and governors. And so in those orders, sometimes they have pretty heavy penalties. Of course, whether or not they have the authority to issue those penalties is also a whole nother legal issue that's being challenged right now. Practical issues related to a shutdown due to a positive test. One of the most common things we're seeing with clients reacting when an employee actually does test positive for COVID is they shut the place down and they bring in a cleaning crew to clean the facility. Massive outbreaks, obviously, we've all seen in the news how scary it was for the meatpacking industry and how a patient zero can lead to a massive outbreak in a workplace. Media inquiries are also on the rise. We are working also, when it takes a village, our PR team, having to respond to media inquiries, not only related to certain things around the Paid Protection Act and things like that that came from the stimulus packages, but also the just if an employee, for example, catches COVID and then they go on social media and talk about the workplace and that starts trending, a journalist will pick that up and they'll have questions for the company about whether there's truth in what is being read on social media. And so we're having to respond to those inquiries. Union activity. Unions were created because of workplace safety. And so here we are now talking about measures employers should be taking with respect to keeping the workplace safe. And a lot of employees are expressing concerns that their employers aren't doing enough. And of course, those conversations can lead to a belief that maybe a union could make it better. Employee expectations. I think what Amy said was really important about being very transparent, telling your employees exactly where you are, what you're doing. They don't always know, they don't always see it, and so they might make some assumptions. So being very transparent in multiple modes of communication, using your social media platforms, using video webinars like Amy had described, I think are all really important tools. And of course, the more you educate, the less confused and irate employees might be about making certain false assumptions, which of course would decrease your risk of union activity in those workplaces. EEOC charges are also on the rise right now. The EEOC is actually starting to track their COVID charges of discrimination. And what I mean by that is usually if a client, for example, and we've seen this, and it's coming from a place of concern, but when a client decides, you know what, based on the CDC telling us that our vulnerable populations are at a higher risk, we're going to keep those people at home right now. Well, the EEOC says, no, you're not. And they have a lot of guidance on their own website specifically addressing those issues. And then lawsuits. I think today I tracked the number of lawsuits that have been filed, and it's over 2,500. And of course, there are a lot of courts that are still closed. And so we fully assume and are preparing for the possibility that when every court system reopens, those numbers, that 2,500 number that's slowly climbing, is just going to exponentially increase.
Thank you. So Vanessa, as we progress through this webinar, I'm going to ask you about how to mitigate some of these specific risks, but can you just give us a big picture? What do organizations need to do in general, big picture, to address these risks?
Yeah, so I think big picture, take a step back. You have to ask yourself, what is going to be my solution for compliance? How am I going to keep my workplace as safe as possible? And how am I going to comply with all of these new guidelines and regulation? Part of that big picture question is, number one, do I even have the bandwidth to do it? Do I have enough people in my village in order to make this work, in order to comply with everything that's coming out and to cover all of these risks on the left-hand side of this screen? Do I have the bandwidth to do it? Do I know where to find the information? And then the second part is developing a plan for encountering all of those risks. So when OSHA comes knocking at your door, do you have a plan to comply? What are you going to say and how are you going to handle it? I think from a big picture perspective, that's the number one issue. And then don't underestimate the time it's going to take to actually put those solutions in place and creating those plans for when you do encounter these risks. I would say for the Adecco group, all of you have said already that we've been working around the clock, and that's absolutely correct. We are in a unique position, though, that we are in every single industry across the United States. So some clients may be sitting here going, well, I may not have to work around the clock because I'm only in the food packing industry. So I only need to worry about the food packing guidelines set out by the CDC and OSHA and then know my state and local orders, right? But for the Adecco group, we have been in a really unique position where we have to know what's happening for small and medium-sized businesses, what's happening for the office environment, what's happening in food packaging. There's some guidelines on engineering. We got to go figure that out. Oh, healthcare. CDC is talking about the healthcare industry now. We have to understand that. So we're in a unique position in that our village is a little bit bigger than probably most organizations who have the privilege of staying in one specific industry.
Absolutely. And I can tell you because of our unique position and because of all the work and time we put into this and because of our clients questioning and asking us for some solutions or for some help, that was really the catalyst as to what spurred us to put the reInvent program into place so that we could take the resources that we have used and the knowledge that we have and be able to get it out to clients. Laura Schrader on this call. Laura, would you mind just piping in for a quick second here? You were instrumental in building this program and putting together the training for some of our consultants. Can you just give us a very quick big picture understanding of the reInvent solution and the workshop with the HR advisory professionals?
Sure. So we created this reInvent program, which really was to fill the gap for these business or institutional clients who simply, to Vanessa's point, didn't have the bandwidth really to keep up with federal, state, or the local regulatory guidance themselves, or who perhaps lack the luxury of legal counsel or large in-house HR and risk teams to really create that COVID-19 governance program for them. And so we put together this program to address solutions and provide solutions and resources for clients in some of the really key areas for COVID response. And so that includes investment solutions, safety solutions, solutions to navigate the risk areas, many of which are outlined here. And then of course, talent engagement, which is a huge part of the COVID response, as well as looking at your plans for the future. One of the first things that we did with our reInvent program is we actually took all of these learnings that Vanessa and Amy's teams have put together and the best practices and the tools that they have developed to really have a safe COVID plan. And we took a set of executive level HR consultants that we work with, and we put them through this workshop for that knowledge transfer of those best practices in many different areas, such as return to work decisions and safety, the impact of COVID on federal laws, business continuity plans, organization and tracking of the documents, the practices, other evidence, as well as then, of course, communication plans.
Excellent. Vanessa, before I move to mitigating the risk of this potential liability, is there anything you want to share about the theories of liability?
Yeah, just kind of big picture. 1 through 7 here highlights some of the most common trends we're seeing as an employer who has locations across the entire country. So there's some big picture things. Number 1, screening. How are you going to screen your employees for COVID? Are you going to test for the virus or not to test for the virus? Are you going to issue questionnaires based on illnesses or sicknesses or symptoms related to the virus? Are you going to take temperatures to check or not to check? Those are all questions related to how you're going to properly screen your employees. Failure to protect employees from symptomatic persons. What's your policy going to be when somebody is suffering symptoms from COVID-19? Failure to cleanse and sanitize the workplace. That goes back to what we're seeing for the most part when there is patient 0 related to COVID. They all shut down and they're cleaning the facility. Failure to provide personal protective equipment, gloves, hand sanitizer, face masks, although the OSHA guidelines will tell you a face mask is actually not PPE because a face mask protects other people from the virus, not the person. But still, face masks fall under that broad category of something to consider. Are we going to provide them or are we not going to provide them? Failure to implement a social distancing policy. CDC says that social distancing, staying 6 feet apart from one another, is the #1 way to mitigate all of those risks on the left-hand side there. So how are you going to do that? And what if you just can't? Then what? Failure to implement a telework or work from home policy. What I'm always telling my internal colleagues when they ask me, hey, our stay-at-home order was lifted, is it time to come back to work? No, we got to push pause, because a lot of those orders, when they do lift the stay-at-home order that was in place, state that if you can continue to telework, you should. So we have to have that conversation first. And then, of course, the big one, failure to implement various government guidelines. Again, the CDC and OSHA has wonderful guidance out there now. It's very organized, it's industry specific, sometimes it's role specific within an industry. And of course, they're guidelines, they're not rules of law. However, what happens usually is that a guideline kind of becomes the de facto standard of care. And so if you're not following the guidelines, then your liability and risk on that left-hand side significantly increases.
So I would love to talk a little bit more about those guidelines and what resources companies should go to as a best practice to create these return to work plans and execution strategies. So where should companies start, and what are the best resources and guidance to mitigate all of the theories of liability and risk exposure that we just discussed?
Yeah, so let me start with understanding the minimum legal requirements. And I'm not here to say that a company actually should go to these two websites, but what I can tell you is here's where I go. I go to Jackson Lewis's website and Ogletree Deacon's website. These are two law firms who are national employment boutiques. So they work for my resources and what I need, because I have a national employer, and I have an employer who is in every single industry that you can imagine. So Jackson Lewis and Ogletree, from my perspective, do a wonderful job of tracking the 50 state by state guidelines on every single topic you can think of related to COVID. So I have those two links up on my dashboard every single day. I do not turn them off. And when Amy's team calls me with questions, I go exactly to these two websites and I look for what they're both saying. I don't use one, I use them both in conjunction with each other. And what I love about them is that they also give you a hyperlink exactly to the executive order, the local health order, describing exactly what the language is. So that way, if there's any ambiguity or confusion about the way the law firms are describing it, you can go straight to the source, which I find is just a wonderful tool. And then, of course, researching minimum federal guidelines. And I do want to be clear here, this is what you should be following. The CDC and OSHA, they are the two federal agencies that govern workplace safety. So the CDC is issuing guidance sometimes on the same topic as OSHA. CDC will put out a lot of instructions, for example, on temperature taking. So now we know exactly what is needed in order to check the temperature of our workers if in fact a client is going to go in that direction. OSHA, they are updating their website also every single day with very industry specific things, as well as, again, roles within those industries. And then studying best practices, we're constantly talking to our clients about what they're doing and how they have seen either being open as an essential business, how those risks have evolved and what their biggest vulnerabilities are now, and how they are keeping up with compliance, and maybe sharing some best practices with other clients if we see that maybe there's areas of opportunity for improvement, so that we can reduce those liability risks that we described on the last slide. Finally, everyone makes fun of me inside my organization because anytime I'm on the phone talking about how to put together the safest work site possible, I feel like Siskel and Ebert. I give 2 thumbs up to the meatpacking guidelines during every single one of these calls. And the reason why is because let me take you back to when you all saw in the news related to the meatpacking, the chicken plants having these mass outbreaks. A few days later, CDC and OSHA together issued what they call the meatpacking guidelines. And it was the very first time I saw a document all in one place that covered soup to nuts, every single possible thing that you can think of related to the workplace, with hyperlinks on other tools that the employer can use to address those risks. So for example, they talked about an obvious easy one, putting posters up at the front of the facility and throughout the facility. And then they provided a hyperlink to actually take you exactly to where you can print off those posters. They talked about, and I can remember reading this and it hadn't dawned on me yet, but they talked about creating one-way hallways. So you didn't have face-to-face transactions while you were walking down a particular hallway, everyone going in the same direction one way and then creating another hallway where they're going back in a different direction. So that way it can reduce the spread of the virus from having that face-to-face contact. So just things that we hadn't really thought about and that maybe weren't in the general guidelines that OSHA originally put out for the workplace. And what I love about this as well, not only is it that soup to nut, thought-provoking document all in one place. When you think about creating the safest workplace possible, here we are in June, and we haven't seen any other headliners related to specific industries, right? The meatpacking guidelines was really a unique situation because those workers were working shoulder to shoulder, and especially in a very cold environment. And so my philosophy is, if that's your biggest, and I don't know if I'm correct, but if that is your biggest risk of a work site, if you can cover all of that in a place that's not like that, then I think you're really setting yourself up for success.
So, you know what? I'm glad you said that because my question is, if a company is looking at the minimum legal requirements in their state, in their municipality, and they're ticking all those boxes, and they are also following all of the mandatory CDC and OSHA guidelines, and they are going above and beyond, are they insulated and safeguarded from the risks?
Yeah, they're not necessarily insulated. It's not, you're not going to see if you check those boxes, you are in a 100% defensible position. First of all, there's a whole nother step to after checking the boxes, right? You have got to make sure your people are following those guidelines and they are not suffering from COVID fatigue, which you know we all are at this point, and it's human nature. So you've got to put tools in place to also ensure those boxes that are checked, they're still checked the next day, a week from now, and a month from now. And companies are asking us to staff positions like safety monitors to make sure people are dedicated to roaming those hallways, looking for risks, reminding people about the face masks, and especially reminding people about social distancing, where to sit, etc. So that's really, really critical.
I do want to talk a little bit about the safety monitors, but I have one more question, Vanessa. Do you see in the companies that you are talking to and what you're hearing internally from our field about our clients, do you feel that companies are striving to go above and beyond, or that they are struggling to stick to the bare minimums that these requirements are demanding?
I would say it's a mixed bag. I see some clients who are really trying to do and reach compliance in every single aspect of their business. I see some clients who are truly doing the bare minimum. I see some clients who are, in fact, doing things differently based on the state that they're located in. So if they have more of a national footprint, or let's say they have a state, a work site location in Florida, Texas, and New Jersey, they are going to follow the guidelines in those particular states. And those guidelines could look very different depending on how the mayor and or the governor, sees the risks of the workplaces in their particular counties or jurisdictions.
So I imagine when companies are putting these return to work plans in place, if they are a company that has locations in multiple different states, do you agree that their approach as to who to return and how to return may be driven by the different requirements in the states and what is more feasible or less risk averse for them?
I think as far as who to return, no. I think that question really falls under federal law related to EEOC, but how to return, absolutely.
Excellent. You know, Laura, Vanessa just shared how the Adecco Group approaches this and some of her advice on all the different places to look to make sure that you are ticking the boxes and doing everything you can, not only to keep your staff safe, but also to mitigate some of these risks. Would you mind sharing just for a few minutes how the reInvent solution assists clients when they're trying to specifically follow these and build these best practices?
Sure, absolutely. So I think that one area of the reInvent program that people should consider as kind of a first step is really looking at some of these HR advisory professionals who can come in and have taken those best practices and learnings from the Adecco Group, a leading global organization, to then really help with setting up best practices, awareness, and making sure that we're following those policies and the guidelines are in place to help protect organizations. So again, we had talked about some of the areas that the workshop had covered, such as the return to work decisions and execution. So around safety, work from home guidelines, workers' rights, leave and sick pay, exposure, reporting, and control plans. All of the impact of COVID on the different federal laws, and so COVID-19 policies and questionnaires that companies should be putting into place, considerations around workers' compensation, which Vanessa has discussed, and we'll go into some more detail around the unemployment reports, the WARN acts for both federal and then the mini warns for state, various posters and communications that need to be in place, the continuity, the business continuity and disaster response plan considerations, and what does an organization need to have in place in those areas. And so really having someone to come in and help put a plan in place and help advise and guide to lessen some of the risk and ensure that companies are utilizing resources that can help guide them through this. And then, of course, Vanessa had mentioned some safety considerations as well. And so one of the things that we have in the reInvent program, in addition to this HR guidance, is some of our safety offerings. And so Vanessa had mentioned safety audits and safety monitors, and that is something that clients are starting to reach out to us for because they're finding that although they have put a safety plan in place, how do they really ensure and assess compliance with those guidelines? And so safety audits is one way to do that, as well as safety monitors, which are going to ensure that the policies and the practices continue to be followed by the workforce. And then also even identify other risk areas that perhaps were not foreseen in that pre-planning stage. The safety monitors also throughout that role can help provide ongoing updates to different changing federal and state guidelines and legal decisions, which, as we know, Amy and Vanessa have both mentioned, change almost daily.
Thank you. You know, you just mentioned workers' comp. I'd love to talk a little bit about workers' compensation because that is clearly one of the risks on the top of everybody's mind. Could you quickly just run through just a basic overview of workers' compensation as a system and how it works, and then talk a little bit about specifically in our COVID-19 environment, how we see this system applying today?
Yeah, generally, just real quick, if you have a workforce and someone on the job gets injured, the workers' comp system allows for that employee to be paid their medical bills and their lost time wages or a portion thereof without having to prove that the employer violated a law or that the employer caused the injury or whether their own negligence had something to do with getting injured. It's basically operates as a no-fault system. There are examples of exceptions, statutory exceptions to workers' compensation. And generally speaking, pre-COVID, if you had the flu, for example, no one ever thought about that person filing a workers' comp claim for catching the flu if they thought a coworker or a boss gave it to them. In the COVID world, we are now seeing specifically the most popular piece of legislation or guidance being passed by states is making sure that healthcare workers, frontline workers are actually being covered by workers' compensation if they contract COVID. However, there have been a couple of states, Illinois was the first one to do it, but their law got overturned. California was the second one to do it, and their law is currently, unless something changed over the weekend, is still considered good law, where now they are expanding workers' comp coverage to anyone in the workplace who contracts COVID if they're actually showing up to work. So of course, not a remote worker. It's only if they are physically having to go into a work site. There's going to be a rebuttable presumption that they got COVID from the workplace. And so then the employer, in order to try to manage that workers' comp risk, they're going to have to look at the costs associated with that claim and decide whether it's going to be in their best interest to defend that claim, what the evidence looks like in order to try to rebut that presumption. And then that's not only California, however, other states are following in their footsteps. And if you go again to that Jackson Lewis or Ogletree link, you can specifically pull up the workers' comp 50 state by state guide, and you can see exactly what the status of the law is in your area on workers' comp.
Excellent. And I'd love if we could talk a little bit about how we at the ADECO group have quantified some of these workers' compensation risks. And I understand that this is just one piece of financial exposure, but I know that people are talking a lot about and wanting to know what this looks like. Would you share on this slide how we did this?
Yeah, we were a little bit concerned while the stay-at-home orders were in place, and also watching Illinois and California and Louisiana and Massachusetts and others passing these types of laws expanding workers' comp coverage, mostly because of just the sheer number of associates we put to work. And as we were thinking about all of the stay-at-home orders being lifted, the type of increase in risk we were going to see for workers' comp. So we reached out to our third-party carriers who provided some information to us based on what they were tracking for the first 6 weeks of the virus. So I will say this data is based on the first 6 weeks of COVID hitting the United States. And we're waiting on this data to be updated so that we can work with our finance teams to ensure we are preparing for these quantifiable risks. But basically what you're seeing is two charts. The first one, our third-party carrier broke it down for us by the high-risk states. And what we mean by that is states where either the virus is high or it's just more expensive to get sick. So they focused a lot on New York and California in the first two. And what you're seeing here is 80% of the people get sick, suffer some symptoms, but they're not having to go to the hospital. And so their medical costs might involve going to a doctor, getting a prescription. That's going to cost around $300 in those really expensive states. However, absenteeism, we all know it's a 14-day quarantine period if you do contract COVID. So you're going to have to cover the lost wages of that individual, and you can see the absence costs were $900. So then it breaks it down by 15% actually get a severe infection, but still no hospitalization. And then 4.3% they were seeing of the population actually being critical and hospitalized. And then, of course, some people passing away from COVID, and that is 0.7%. So you can see in those high-risk states, obviously, the more severe the injury is, the higher the medical cost, and potentially the higher the number of absences related to missed work. The National Council on Compensation Insurance, NCCI, provided us an analysis on the rest of the country. And so in those areas, you can see the biggest difference being critical with hospitalization. Just your hospitalization costs are going to be a little bit less. And then, of course, also just having a severe infection without hospitalization also will be a little bit less. But you can see typically the percentage weighted cost of a workers' comp claim is going to be $15,000 in an expensive state and around $9,000 in a state where it's just cheaper to get sick.
So Vanessa, I know we've talked about putting everything in place to prevent anyone from getting sick and the potential of rebuttable presumptions that you got this at work and all of that about patient zero. But when you're looking at workers' comp, there is a very big need to prevent any spread once patient zero does, if it does show up. You've mentioned, or I believe Amy mentioned, that contact tracers is one fast step that we here at ADECO group took to contain any exposure. And Amy walked us through a little bit how that evolved. When you speak to clients, is this something that you think companies need to consider as part of their return plans?
I feel like our contact tracing team is probably our number one tool to mitigate our risks in most liabilities. And the reason why I say that is because we have trained that team and evolved that team. In the very beginning, they were simply instructing people to stay home and when they can return if they have COVID-19 symptoms, right? So we created this channel of communication for all of our workers to call into a specific number if they were suffering symptoms. And then we trained our call center HR professionals to give them specific instructions related to the CDC. Then what has evolved from there and where we are now is these people are now trained to not only provide those instructions, but also if somebody has actually contracted COVID, if they have a positive test, especially, we conduct contact tracing within our own organization where we ask them, where did you, in the workplace, who did you talk to? Who did you work side by side? What What departments did you go into over a 14-day period? And then we go back and we contact every single one of those individuals and we give them specific instructions related to what the CDC tells us on if they need to stay home or if they can come to work, and if they can come to work, what extra precautions or procedures we need to put in place for those individuals who may have been exposed and or contracted the virus and are asymptomatic. Additionally, what we've done is to also train those individuals to ask very specific investigative questions when somebody does call in and they've contracted COVID, because related to workers' comp, we might not want to engage in the battle of a rebuttable presumption for a $900 claim, but we might want to consider looking at whether there is evidence to establish that rebuttable presumption in a more expensive claim. So we have trained our investigators to ask specific questions related to what does your workplace look like when you were going into work? Were you provided face masks, hand sanitizers? Were you given extra breaks to go wash hands? The time clock systems, is somebody cleaning that? Is it a pen pad where you have to actually touch it and share that? So all of those practices, we try to get the employee to answer. And then we pivot. We also train them to talk about what are they doing with respect to complying with stay-at-home orders in their personal life. Do they know where they think they got the virus? Because those questions can be really, really important in trying to establish whether you have that rebuttable presumption and whether you should even try to contest a workers' comp claim.
You know, there are, I think most people on this call, there are, have heard about contact tracers, as there's a lot of news about states and municipalities hiring these people in droves. Some of the things that you brought up, though, Vanessa, Laura, I would love if you would be able to weigh in, because what we have been seeing is that the contact tracer profile that corporations and companies are looking for is different than what you see with states and municipalities. Laura, can you share a little bit through reInvent how companies we are working with are using them and how these profiles do differ?
Absolutely. So we are seeing a big influx of needs from our clients on the contract tracer side. And I would say that some of the biggest differences in terms of skill sets that we're very, very aware of and making sure that we're providing contact tracers with specific skill sets that include strong communication, and really important that they have the ability or the experience to handle sensitive material and sensitive information. And then, of course, that attention to detail, that thorough interviewing ability, and an innate ability to really connect the dots. And this goes back to what Vanessa was talking about, just in terms of really being able to ask the questions that will lead them to the information that will help protect the organization and ensure that there is not some sort of a larger outbreak.
Okay, so I would love now to move to mitigating the risk of potential liability and things to do to specifically keep the workforce safe. So, Vanessa, I'd love to talk about the guidelines and return to work plans that companies can put into action. This is an excellent list. Vanessa, could you walk us through this?
Yeah, so conducting a site assessment, what that means is looking at your entire workplace and determining where are your biggest risks of spreading the virus potentially and how you're going to mitigate those risks. So whether it is working on an assembly line, working very closely side by side people, whether it's shared equipment or it's a break room or it's a time clock, but assessing those risks and figuring out how you're going to mitigate them. Screening for infection, again, helps screeners to check temperatures or not to check temperatures, to ask certain questions or to not ask certain questions. Those are decisions that you're going to have to make in conjunction with what the CDC and OSHA says, and then, of course, what your local or state orders may say, because your local and state orders might go a little bit further than what the CDC and OSHA recommend. Protect from exposure, again, those contact tracers, and utilizing their skill set to cover a number of other topics, like I described, and how we evolved into creating a really solid and impactful role to help mitigate our risks. Of course, PPE provisioning and policies, Again, I hate saying a face mask is PPE because it's not, but so many people put it into that category. But there's the topic of, do we provide face masks or not? And then, of course, hand sanitizer in high contact shared locations where people are congregating or commonly touching the same thing in the workplace, printers, copiers, things like that. You also have to consider developing social distancing policies and looking at that everywhere. For example, when you walk into the building and you're actually standing in line for that health screen, creating social distancing for the line, how you're going to handle elevators, stairways, the car line. If you have a lot of employees who catch rides, they're not actually driving a vehicle, but they're standing on the property and waiting for their car, their ride to pick them up, creating social distancing policies then there. Cleansing and sanitizing, of course, scheduling sanitizing, and also creating teams on who is going to sanitize, who is not going to sanitize, what equipment is needed for them to be able to sanitize, because the CDC speaks to that as well. Policies and internal communications, that goes to just being very transparent, putting what you're doing in writing to the workforce so that you can produce something of substance to EEOC or OSHA if they start asking questions and investigating your work site. And then, of course, a written COVID-19 plan is incredibly important because it can also serve as your exhibit A to an OSHA complaint, for example, but also allows you to go back to a specific document every single time there's an issue and assess whether you're in compliance with that plan, or even looking at it through hindsight. So if you do have an OSHA complaint or you do have your first test, your positive test, go back to your plan and say, is there anything that we missed that could have prevented this? And then revising that plan and rolling it out accordingly.
So Vanessa, I know that this took a lot of time for us to assess and implement and to continually update these processes as new guidelines are released and revised. But Laura, could you just briefly share with us, when you talk about site assessment checks and some of these safety offerings, would you mind just going down a quick list of how reInvent can help with some of these?
Yes, so really we would have solutions in the reInvent program that could address all of these, starting off first with those site assessments, and that's always, of course, a really good first step. And then moving on to the different safety protocols to put in place, such as the health screeners, the contact tracers, someone to advise around the PPE provisioning and the policies. And then we would also be looking at various additional solutions, such as here on our at policies and internal communications and your written COVID-19 plan. So that HR guidance, as well as any kind of external legal support. So working with some of our contract attorneys that have those substantive backgrounds in these areas that can help advise and lessen your risk. And then, of course, communication and/or public relations experts who have that ability to help you craft your internal colleague communications and engagement plans, any kind of external communications, PR support, brand support, and then, of course, those critical comms and PR facilitation during a crisis period, and helping, of course, with the media inquiries as well.
Excellent, thank you. And I would love now if we can move to beyond returning, working now for the future. Amy Herron, clearly the employee experience has changed, not just at the Adecco Group, but probably in every country. What considerations has your team specifically taken to ensure a positive employee experience and put together a plan for the future?
Well, Nicole, first of all, we are definitely, again, listening to our employees and what they want. So in looking at all of the resources we have at our fingertips and looking at CDC and listening to our governor and mayor and such as to when we believe it is safe to go back to work. First, do the employees want to go back to work? Are they in a class that may be more vulnerable to catching the virus and they want to stay at home? And what does it look like? And again, we're going to allow that. So it's not like we're opening our offices on X date and everyone has to come back to work. So we're definitely listening and learning what people want to do. And if they are successful working at home, allowing that long term. What we're looking at now is we do in this, we're calling an interim phase, kind of from now until the end of the year. How do we set people up to work successfully from home? So we're determining, what is your primary workplace, or what would that be? And if more days of the week you're going to be at home, then what do we allow them to do from a workspace? Do they take equipment home? Are we going to give stipends? Are we going to set up for new hires specific equipment and things to allow them to from home? So we haven't even solidified that 100% at this time. All of this is a work in progress, but we have definitely moved from what we're doing today to what we are doing in the future. So it really comes to trusting your colleagues, trusting your employees to ensure that they can work from home, that they are set up to be successful, and that our clients are taken care of. And we've really changed that from having to be all in one location to collaborate and work effectively and efficiently to really this workforce that can definitely handle the demands that we have as a company with over 700 locations and thousands of clients to make sure that the needs are met. So it's an exciting time for us, and we don't have all of the answers solidified, but again, by using that village of resources that we have, coming up with the best solutions for the future.
And what do you think the biggest challenges will be for HR executives like yourself as we forge forward and kind of move into this new way of work? I can tell you many of our clients are discussing they're reducing real estate footprints. They are considering different and new trainings for managers, remote work employees. They're excited about the potential that hiring talent, may no longer have to be confined by a zip code, and you may have access to talent anywhere across the country or frankly internationally if remote is truly an option. So do you have any advice as to how to forge forward or what you think the biggest challenges may be?
Yeah, it's a mindset shift, really, as to you have to keep an open mind, and the possibilities really are limitless. This has really disrupted the way that we are used to working. And so the companies that are able to use this as a jump start into a different way of working, utilizing technology and highly skilled colleagues and employees, they're the ones that are really going to rise and be successful in the future. So keep an open mindset, listen, be open to new ideas, and use this as an opportunity to try something new. That's going to be our biggest challenge, but also our biggest opportunity.
Amy, Vanessa, thank you so much for your participation today. For the remainder of the webinar, we are going to briefly discuss some of the solutions that Laura has mentioned, and then we will get to as many questions as we can, but we may run a little bit over. Laura, could you share a little bit about the reInvent program in addition to what you have shared thus far?
You bet. So this first area of the reInvent program really focuses on investment and some of the areas that Amy had just mentioned that companies are really looking at and assessing right now, as well as in the future. How do we strengthen our position as a company and emerge stronger than before? And so some of the areas around investment that we have solutions teed up for our clients is business review and financial assessments. So things like CFO services, if you don't have a CFO, cost savings assessments and recommendations, as well as organizational design recommendations. And companies are really looking at, does the way that our organization was structured pre-COVID, does it need to look like that post-COVID? And there may be some organizational design recommendations and efficiencies that can be put into place. And then, of course, those real estate and contract negotiations. And Nicole, you had mentioned this, that so many companies are really reassessing their real estate footprint, knowing that a lot of their employees could now be working from home indefinitely. And so providing our clients with external legal support from contract attorneys for those project-based lease renegotiations, or even on other types of contracts, such as supplier and manufacturer contract renegotiations. There are solutions in place to address client needs in those areas. And then also business intelligence consulting, and Amy had mentioned this, but really looking at how do we assess our engagement and our efficiency via technology tools, and what worked for us before may be a little bit different than what we need right now. So what are some of the recommendations for new technology tools that could help maximize the employee productivity, both for your on-site workforce as well as your remote workforce? And then that takes us into the E part of our program, which is ensuring safety. And so we've talked about some of these, and we have different safety solutions really from the very first step of the safety training development. So what do we need to put into place? What is that training protocol that needs to be put into place around cleaning and other safety measures? And then how do we conduct that on-site or even virtual training on that safety protocol? Once we have that established, moving into solutions around safety audits and safety monitors, which we've discussed. So the plan is in place, but how do you ensure that it's being followed properly? And then, of course, those screeners. And so we had the health screener offering, the temperature taker offering, as well as the contact tracers that we've discussed. And then even some solutions around safety as it relates to facility support. So working with landlords and vendors to assess and ensure that the CDC guidelines on airflow and ventilation are also being followed at your on-site locations. The next category where we have solutions is really around that navigating risk. And so one of the great kind of first steps that we've talked about is that site assessment. So really looking at, does your site comply with the federal, the state, the local, the CDC guidelines? And are we assessing that site compliance in accordance with those guidelines? And what are some of the perhaps changes or adjustments that need to be put into place to ensure compliance with those guidelines? Then, of course, we have the HR advisory services, which is that guidance from our executive level HR professionals who have attended Adecco's COVID-19 workshop and can really help advise and guide clients to lessen their risk in all of the best practices and all of the protocol that needs to be put into place around a safe return to work, as well as a better approach to the future, even when it comes to things like talent engagement. Then, of course, we have the legal and risk assessments, which goes back again to leveraging some of those contract attorneys that have those substantive backgrounds that could work with your C-suite, work with your in-house legal and your risk departments, or even work with your outside counsel and really help keep the company abreast of the changing legal landscape while also helping defray any of your outside counsel costs. And as we've heard Vanessa say, the tremendous amount of work that it's taken for her to really stay up to date and to help guide Adecco through this process. We know that many clients do not have such access to that type of in-house legal guidance. And so this is a great way to utilize some contract attorneys in that area. And then, of course, on the communications and public relations side, which we've talked about a little bit, and that's really having solutions in place to help clients craft those internal communications, external communications, brand protection during this time, and then, of course, help with those critical comms that need to be coming out in any kind of a crisis period. And then the final category of solutions that we've developed as part of this program is really around that talent engagement. And a lot of this talks to looking at the future. And so how do you emerge from this stronger? One of the first things would be our remote workforce management. So we understand that many clients have had to go very, very quickly, literally overnight in many cases, to a remote workforce. And many companies are not, they don't have a lot of experience managing a remote workforce. And so we have a lot of experience at the Adecco Group managing remote workforces. And we have developed this program where a client can work with a single point of contact, a program director, to really manage that remote contingent labor workforce and help provide reporting, streamline communication, virtual onboarding. All of it would be very custom tailored to the client's objectives for success. Another talent engagement solution that we have is around best practices, rewards and recognition programs, and really that talent engagement. Of course, benefits consulting. So many clients are assessing their benefits and did the benefits of pre-COVID match what they need in the post-COVID world, providing recommendations, perhaps more robust EAP with mental health and counseling options, and conducting employee surveys to look at what benefits would be most beneficial to employees now and beyond and really help increase that satisfaction and retention. Of course, the talent mapping and organizational design, which we've talked a little bit in conjunction with some of our financial services, but identifying who are the essential departments in the current teams that we need to have on site. How do we assess current role functionality for going forward to meet our business plans and objectives? How do we assess our current talent? And does it align with the role functionality? And then also that long-term talent development and talent acquisition plan, and really ensuring that we and our clients are positioning themselves as a best-in-class workplace, both now and in the future. And then, of course, finally, the contingent workforce solutions. So we realize that many clients are experiencing sudden influx of business coming back. Maybe they're not quite equipped to handle that with their current staff. And so having those contingent workforce and contingent labor solutions that give you a lot of flexibility to bring on staff when you need it, that just-in-time talent solution in areas of HR, risk, finance and accounting, compliance, operations, vendor management, marketing, and of course, legal.
Laura, thank you so much. I'd love to jump into some of these Q&A. We are over time, but I'd love it if we could answer just a couple of these. Vanessa, what do you see as the biggest risk to staying in compliance?
I think probably COVID fatigue. In the beginning, everyone was really gung-ho about washing hands and staying 6 feet apart and wearing that face mask when the government told them to wear it. And now we're getting a little bit more complacent, a little bit more comfortable. It's getting hotter in certain parts of the country, so face masks are becoming more cumbersome. So keeping up with that COVID fatigue and making sure you have people in the workplace who are monitoring and keeping safety at top of mind and auditing those plans that we put in place to make sure we're mitigating risk in those areas and ensuring that operationally the plan works. I also think Amy's point in mindset shift, I think for any organization who is not looking at the way to do this in the future and looking at those cost saving initiatives that Laura described to help mitigate, especially the offset to loss of revenue for those clients who unfortunately did have to literally shut their doors overnight. Just the financial risks associated with that, I think, is also really significant.
Thank you. And I see here one for Amy. Amy, have any organizations provided stipends to their employees to offset overhead costs? What amount, frequency, and policy should be put in place is the question.
So yes, I have seen where companies are implementing stipends. I've seen as much as $50 to $1,000. So it really depends. I don't think that there is a right amount. It depends on what, if you already have a lot of the things, employees have laptops, headsets, keyboards, those type things already. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but those who aren't set up for remote work at all, I've seen it a larger amount. As I said earlier, we're still grappling through that ourselves as to what is the right answer for this. So I think this is where most of the companies are. They're trying to decide what makes sense for them. And you have to look at it holistically. What is your future way of work? And what is it that the employee needs to be productive and able to focus on the tasks at hand?
Thank you. And Amy, here's another question. I think you and Vanessa touched on this, but this has come up a couple times, so I'd just like to ask it again. How do you recommend companies handling employees who don't want to come back to the office at all and who want to remain remote? What is your advice there?
If it is possible, if the actual work being done can be done remote, you need to try to accommodate that request and see if that fits into the future way of work for you. I know right now, as I said, when we are starting to open up offices across the country and in different areas, we do have some of this situation. And we're able to work that through case by case with the employee and accommodate them. In some cases, after talking, it isn't 100% remote, but they just want to come into the office, not 5 days a week. People right now are still struggling with personal situations, maybe being a caregiver or having their children home for the summer, with summer clubs and such being closed in some cases. So we're really trying to be flexible for our people and look at them holistically. What are their needs to be successful? And we're really trying to be that employer of choice and be employee friendly to help them through this time.
Thank you, and we'll do one more. So Vanessa, someone asked about the potential application of the workers' comp bar if there is transmission to employees' family members. What are your thoughts there?
If I understand the question, it is whether or not a family member gets COVID from somebody who is showing up to a particular job and whether that person can sue the organization and whether workers' comp would bar them from it. Is that the way you?
That's how I'm reading it.
Okay, so generally speaking, I don't think workers' comp would serve as a bar, or I don't think workers' comp would cover that type of claim. And I think the family member would have a difficult time making a claim. But it does make me wonder for clients who have consumer facing interaction. So, for example, a restaurant or a grocery store, whether or not COVID is going to become the next slip and fall case. So we always see the commercials about whether you've fallen at a public place and suffered injuries, whether or not there's going to be claims from people who are saying, I didn't go anywhere. I self quarantined, I self isolated, but the only place I went was to my grocery store and I got COVID 5 days later. Whether we're gonna see claims trying to sue that grocery store for covering any medical bills, et cetera, related to contracting COVID.
Vanessa, Amy, Laura, thank you so much. There are many more questions here. We are definitely out of time, but we will come up with a way to group these questions together, get some answers out, or again, please feel free to contact us. And here we have Laura's email address below. Any questions you have, if you'd like to learn more about our reInvent solution, please reach out. We'd like to be here for you so that we can all get through this together. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.